At breakfast.
BBC Newcastle, radio for the North East.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us. 0191 232 6565 is our text number if you want to join the discussion. Investigations are continuing to try and find out if any tower blocks in the North East have combustible cladding. The government says samples of cladding from 11 high-rise buildings in England have been found to be combustible since the Grenfell Tower fire. Theresa May announced that there would be further testing in a statement in the House of Commons yesterday.
The House should, of course, be careful on speculating what caused this fire. But as a precaution, the government has arranged to test cladding in all relevant tower blocks. Mr. Speaker, shortly before I came to the chamber, I was informed that a number of these tests have come back as combustible. The relevant local authorities and local fire services have been informed, and as I speak, they are taking all possible steps to ensure buildings are safe and to inform affected residents.
Well, Tyne Wear Fire and Rescue have said that to date they haven't received any information from local authorities and private property companies to indicate that there are buildings in our area that have used it. But
for one Newcastle man living in the Sycamores, a tower block in Riverside Dean in Scotswood, part of Newcastle, it's not just the cladding that's a worry. Diane Tate, who lives there with a 6-year-old daughter, has some fire safety concerns that she told the BBC about.
The living room area, the kitchen, the dining room is all one huge open plan space. There's no door separating it from a front door, so there would be no way to escape a fire. The door to my front door has a big gap underneath it that smoke would get under. I live at the top, so there's no water pressure. I wouldn't be able to wet towels if other people were running their taps. I wouldn't be able to block that gap off. I'd have no way of getting out of my flat. Me and my daughter would be dead. Why haven't you installed sprinkler systems? Why haven't you made your fire doors actually fit so that they are fit for purpose? Why have you said that children don't live in your blocks when children do? I've lived in them since 2001, so I was here before the renovation, and to be honest, they were safer then. They didn't have the cladding, they had an on-site concierge in every single block. Your front door fit the door frame, no smoke would have got under, they were safer before.
Well, after we'd met with Diane, Your Homes Newcastle visited her to discuss her concerns. David Langhorne, Assets and Development Director at Your Homes Newcastle, sent us this statement.
It's quite long. We reassured Miss Tate that each dwelling within the block acts as an individual fire compartment and that stairwells and corridors are separated by fire doors, creating individual fire compartments there too. Therefore, Miss Tate's flat is at no increased risk from her open plan living space. All of the tower blocks that YHN manages on behalf of Newcastle City Council have water risers installed. This allows the fire and rescue service to distribute water at each floor without running hoses. All of the high-rise blocks YHN manage for Newcastle City Council have fire doors installed. YHN has an ongoing planned investment programme of fire door replacements, and several customers have contacted us about a paragraph in a newsletter that we distributed last weekend, as it said that we do not house families with children in high-rise blocks. This was incorrect, and we apologise for any confusion caused. There have been a very small number of allocations in high-rise blocks recently to families with dependent children, although we try and avoid it where possible and have encouraged customers to consider alternatives. We also respect the customer's right to choose where they would like to live.
Well, Nick Forbes is the leader of Newcastle City Council and the Labour leader of the Local Government Association, and he joins us now in the BBC Newcastle studios. Good morning, Nick. Thanks for coming in. Do you know, Nick, if any cladding is being used in our region that could be combustible?
We've been looking at the cladding used in Newcastle on the range of buildings. We know with some confidence that the cladding that was used in Grenfell Tower has not been used in any of the council blocks in Newcastle. I've had assurances on that. The cladding is signed off when a building is clad by something called Building Regulations Control, and the council in Newcastle has been going through the records of controls that we've signed off to double check that blocks that aren't owned by the council haven't had this cladding used. We've not found any so far, but we can't give a categorical assurance because the council doesn't sign off all of the buildings in the city. There are some blocks which have been signed off by private operators, and we're not able to see those records. So that's why I think we need a change in the regulations so that where building regulations are signed off by bodies other than the council, there is transparency and accountability for that sign-off process so everybody can be assured in future.
And do you know how much testing has happened here in the northeast?
We've been sending off for double checking purposes in fact, there's only 5 blocks in Newcastle that we're aware of that have used cladding of any sort, and it's certainly not the cladding that was used in Grenfell Tower. But we've been double checking that. So far, those tests have been coming back absolutely fine. Of course, it's up to the other registered social landlords and the other owners of tower blocks in the city to undertake the same process. But it looks to me as though we don't have the same levels of materials being used here in the northeast. That's because we've taken active decisions to invest properly in our social housing over the last several decades. We've seen social housing as an important part of our housing mix, and we've made sure that we do invest in its safety, its security, its fire protection measures and so on. So one of the other important examples that we heard about just in that clip just now was about what are called risers. That's systems that get water right from the very top, from the bottom to the very top of every tower block. And that means that if there is a fire, the fire service can just plug their hose in on whatever floor it's needed. And one of the tragic things about the Grenfell Tower disaster was we saw those awful pictures of the fire service having to spray water from ground level because that was the only way they could get it into the building. And that's one of the big important differences between our blocks here and Grenfell Tower.
And yet, you know, there definitely is fear amongst residents in Newcastle. We heard Diane. To go back to Diane's story, most of her points were answered by Your Homes Newcastle, but she does ask for a sprinkler system to be installed. We know it's expensive. We've heard lots of talk about how expensive it is, but isn't a life worth it? Isn't sprinklers an option? Oh,
sprinklers are absolutely an option. Every building more than 30 metres high, built since 2007, has to have a sprinkler system fitted as it's built. The issue is older buildings that haven't got sprinkler systems fitted, and what we'll be doing over the next few days and weeks is looking at the cost and the practicality of fitting sprinkler systems into tower blocks. It's certainly not something that we've ruled out. What we have to do, though, is make a balanced judgment about whether the fire safety precautions that we have in place are adequate or whether we need to do more. And certain aspects of that will be guided by the outcome of the inquiry into Grenfell Tower, because I think there's going to be now a national debate around safety and security in tower blocks, and we want to make sure that, of course, we invest, and we will do investment where as and when it's needed, but we also need to make sure that we don't cause too much disruption to tenants where it's perhaps unnecessary.
The thing is, all of these things seem to take time, don't they, in the coming days and weeks, and yet we saw, it wasn't days and weeks, it was minutes that it took for Grenfell Tower to go up. How quickly can things be changed? Can legislation be changed?
Well, there is a really significant problem that we have in terms of finding the money for this, because investment in social housing for council housing is run through something called a housing revenue account, and basically people pay their rents, and those rents are used to reinvest in improvements for the buildings. And the government have not only restricted the amount in that account by forcing us to make rent reductions, and that's had a financial impact of £19 million a year this year alone in Newcastle. That's 19 million less to spend on these kind of measures.
So you haven't got the money.
So and also, the government have also capped the amount that we can borrow against that account, which means that we can't look at longer-term measures by borrowing, which is another way in which we could fund it. So there's an important and urgent conversation that I'll be having with government around giving us more flexibilities to get on and do this essential work, and basically take the handcuffs off local government. What we've seen in Kensington and Chelsea is an awful example of what happens when a council ignores and runs down social housing. We haven't done that here, but we are working with one hand tied behind our back, and that has to change.
Is Tyne & Wear Fire Service funded properly?
Again, there is an issue about the cuts that we've had to Tyne & Wear Fire and Rescue Service. We know that it's faced cuts of nearly 30% over the last 6 years, and the government's view has been, well, the number of fires have gone down, therefore the number of firefighters needs to go down as well. The fire service is absolutely crucial in situations like this. And my concern is that despite the fact that everybody is saying what an amazing job they do, the government have not yet reversed their cuts to local authorities and to fire services, and we're expecting further cuts in the next few years unless the government changes track.
And finally, very quickly, just to reassure people that are listening that do live in high-rises, that have families that live in high-rises here in Newcastle, what would you say to them to reassure them?
I would say that please be vigilant. Please make sure that your communal areas are kept clean and tidy and that nobody dumps rubbish. But we have checked every block. We do know that we've got water available in the event of a fire. We've also got smoke detectors wired in, not just to individual flats to alert residents, but also to the control room. So as soon as anything happens, the fire service is immediately notified of it, and there will be a very quick response. And the other important thing is most of our tower blocks have 2 fire escapes rather than 1, which is another important safety feature for our blocks. So although you can never say never, because the vast majority of fires in the home start either from an abandoned chip pan or from somebody falling asleep with a lighted cigarette. If residents take care and look after the communal areas too, then we absolutely minimise the risk of any fires breaking out.
Nick Forbes, thank you, the leader of Newcastle City Council and the Labour leader of the Local Government Association. Thank you very much for coming in.
It's 0191 232 6565 to get in touch with us on any of the stories we're talking about this morning, whether they're serious or light or trite. Your quarter past pleaser, please, Anna.
How dare you say that this is